All right, we are ready to begin. Good afternoon. My name is Karen Engle, and I teach here in the law school, along with my colleague, Neville Hode, in the English department. We co-direct the Rapoport Center for Human Rights and Justice. And it's our pleasure to welcome you to our 15th annual conference. The Rapoport Center is an interdisciplinary center at the University of Texas. At the intersection of academia and advocacy, our mission is to serve as a focal point for critical interdisciplinary analysis and practice of human rights and social justice. I asked Neville to join me up here in the welcome to the conference. He only became co-director September 1, but he has been deeply involved with the center since the beginning, was on the steering committee the very first year we formed 15 years ago. And he's very much served as co-director on this project and this conference since we began to conceptualize it last fall. So he'll tell you a bit about the conference and how it came together, and then I'll say a word about some of the animating ideas behind it before we get to this afternoon and evening's main attractions, the first of which will be the poetry reading that we'll introduce in a few moments. So, Neville.
Thank you, Karen. Is this on? Can you hear me? Because I'm naturally fairly loud, but this is a big auditorium, so I think I need the mic. Thank you, Karen. Welcome to everybody. It's very exciting to be here and to see you all. Our conference this year is called Prison Abolition, Human Rights and Penal Reform, from the local to the global. It is in many ways a follow-up to work that a number of us at the Rapoport Center, in collaboration with scholars and some human rights advocates around the world, have been involved in for some time. Noting concern about and attempting to resist a turn within the human rights movement to promote criminal law, international and domestic, as its principal enforcement mechanism. Karen is going to say quite a bit more about that. But it is also a beginning, as we see this as an opportunity to engage with and learn from many people who have worked on, thought creatively about, and promoted a new way of approaching justice that does not rely on ideologies and practices of the carceral state. In a moment, we will tell you a bit about how the conference is organized thematically, how we came up with the topic, panels, and roundtables, and who the participants and audience are in very broad strokes. But first, I want to thank a number of people who've made this event possible. And first, I want to thank Karen, even though she told me I'm not allowed to. It's one of my virtues that I mostly listen, but I don't always listen. It's been a huge amount of work. And without Karen Engle, there probably wouldn't be a Rapoport Center. And this event, if it happened at all, would look very different. And you've been doing this for 15 years. And I think we're all indebted to your brilliance, your commitment, your anxiety, your determination to sort of make us be the best that we can be, and to actually create a truly interdisciplinary human rights center on this campus. And I think without your work, we would all be intellectually and ethically much worse off. So thank you, Karen. I next want to thank the conference organizing committee, including Professors Simone Brown, Denise Gilman, Jennifer Lauren, Marisol Lebron, Roger Reeves, who some of us are struggling to recognize, but who Karen will introduce in a bit, Kristen Smith, Jordan Steiker, and our postdoctoral fellow, Eddie Shaw. Thanks, Eddie. I don't know if it takes a village, but it takes a hell of a lot of interns to produce this event. So many Rapoport Center interns, scholars, and fellows beginning last spring who were familiar with prison abolition and had a passion for incorporating it into our work and thinking about the relationship between it, prison reform, and human rights. Particularly Kevin Trahan, who I saw, Tobias Wilson, who is unfortunately in Nashville, and Iman Shaw. So they did a lot of work on this. Our current scholars and interns, who even though they only began 3 weeks ago, so I think it's been a steep learning curve, and I'm glad you're all still standing, have been indispensable to final coordination and publicity, including coordinating other student volunteers. So please stand if you are in the room. If Sarah hasn't got you running around doing other tasks, please stand. Ashley Berry, Savannah Kumar, Elizabeth Hamilton, Carol Zenoa, Fabiola Barreto, and Meryl Hakim. Okay, we'll clap for them, although they're all working elsewhere. Also, if you're a student volunteer, stand up. Okay, not. They're all out working. Sarah Eliasson, administrator at the Rapoport Center, without whom none of us could have done the work I just described. And that is actually putting it very mildly. She has managed to manage this complex multi-ring conference, always with an upbeat attitude, and as participants know, has been behind getting them information on panels, helping to get them here, finding housing for them, etc. She's been assisted in these efforts by two others, Ariel Travis, our assistant director who's out on maternity leave, and that was pretty good timing, I have to say. And Sabrina Barton, who joined us only 3 weeks ago and has done a great job of figuring us out and moving many balls forward. So thank you to Sabrina. Funding is essential for these events. Okay, I'm saying it obviously. So we are grateful to the Ford Foundation for supporting our work, to the many donors of the Farenthold Lecture, and then to the many centers and programs across campus and individuals behind them. If you look at the back of the program, you will see that this is truly a cross-campus event. And Karen likes to joke is that actually mostly what we do is pass the same $1,000 around. But an event of this scale required extensive more support and hustling. So I would like to thank the Joins Reading Room, the Center for European Studies, the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies, the Moody College of Communication, the William Wayne Justice Center for Public Interest Law, the Center for Women's and Gender Studies, the Capital Punishment Center, the Lilas Benson Latin American Studies and Collections, the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies, the Center for Mexican American Studies, the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, the Department of Sociology's Center for Population Research, the New Writers Project, the James A. Michener Center for Writers, the Department of English, the Program in Native American and Indigenous Studies, the Francis Tolton Sissy Farenthold Endowed Lecture Series in Peace, Social Justice, and Human Rights, and the Graduate School. So, Roger and I, we all go. I don't know if many of them have representatives here, but we are very happy to take your money. Okay, last but not least, we are thankful to the participants and the audience here today. We have close to 400 people registered for the conference, a record by far for the center. And some of you have come a long distance to be here. 62 of you are participants, and you have traveled to be here from 9 different countries and 4 continents. Over a third of you are advocates, artists, activists, and/or organizers, working on prison abolition, decriminalization, policing, racial justice, and gender justice. You have organized inside and outside of prisons, and many of you bring experiences both direct and indirect with the carceral state to bear on your work. Many of you are academics coming from multiple disciplines within the law, domestic and international, and from a range of fields in humanities and social sciences. From what I can tell, the registrants mirror the composition of the conference speakers. We have a number of audience members from local grassroots and advocacy organizations in Austin, in addition to those on the program, and we have students and faculty from across campus. In this room are the makings of an important dialogue that will take place over the next very packed 48 hours. I hope you're feeling full of stamina. The breadth of the conference is impressive, even if I say so myself. Many of the panels emerged from nearly 150 responses we received to a call for papers that were sent out, part of which is reproduced on the inside cover of your program. Karen is going to tell you a bit more about some of our thinking behind the conference, after which we will begin the poetry reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Neville. As Neville mentioned, we see this conference as both a continuation of work we have done and a beginning of deeper work that we need to do. We believe this conference might be the first one to explicitly bring together international human rights and prison abolition. So I'll say a word about the impulse behind that and 4 of the issues that we see emerging from the encounter. And at the end of the conference, there will be a chance to think back and look at the many, many other issues that emerge as well. First, the part of the call for proposals in your program, there's a part of the call for proposals on the inside cover, and I'll just refer to a couple of things there, which it contends that, quote, the international human rights movement relies upon criminal punishment as its primary enforcement tool for many violations. Now, that might be surprising to some of you who are not in the field. Indeed, you might think of human rights as largely focused on things like prison conditions, due process, and even on getting people out of prison. That's what Amnesty International originally formed to do, after all. But over time, it began to support the development of international criminal law and institutions and calls for criminal responses to human rights violations at the domestic level as well. And it did so largely in sync with the human rights movement more broadly. So let me give you a recent example that demonstrates this shift in advocacy. In 2015, the Institute for Policy Studies, a progressive think tank on U.S. domestic and foreign policy, awarded its annual Human Rights Award to 2 criminal lawyers. The domestic award went to Daryl Atkinson, who advocates for the rights of convicted felons. Almudena Bernabeu received the international award for what IPS called her, quote, successful prosecution of several of the worst Latin American perpetrators of crimes against humanity. Now, I don't think IPS's choice of a lawyer working on behalf of the formerly incarcerated on one hand and a prosecutor on the other was an attempt to be even-handed. The organization sought to honor those whom it saw as protecting human rights, and in the context of the US, that means fighting for the rights of defendants and the convicted. But for international human rights law and much of the movement, it means nearly the opposite. So the Washington Post published a story on the awards the following day, noting that Atkinson's recognition coincided with, quote, a growing reconsideration of how the nation prosecutes and punishes. In contrast, and with no sense of dissonance or judgment, it quoted Bernabeu as saying, quote, I'm a prosecutor at heart. I'm a judgmental person by birth, and went on to identify her as a hunter rather than a healer. I don't want to take care of the poor or those who have been tortured or abused, she says. I want this world to stop abusing people. That this approach to international human rights has become prevalent strikes us as problematic. Not only does it over-individualize and decontextualize the notion of abuse, it carries a deterrent message that is unpersuasive. Thus, we ask the question, which you'll also see in the program, what would it mean for the human rights movement to take seriously calls for prison abolition and the racial inequities that overcriminalization, and perhaps we should have just said criminalization, produces and reproduces? We might further ask, how would it change what constitutes a human rights violation and what the meaning and significance is of enforcement? We look forward in the next 2 days to taking seriously literature, activism, legal practice, and advocacy aimed at abolition. We're eager to hear more about what abolition looks like in daily practice, how it reckons with violence, and how it accounts for histories of slavery, colonialism, racial capitalism, and other forms of domination. Second, at the same time, we hope to provide an opportunity to hear from people who want to reflect more on the human rights movement and some of the ways in which it has provided for transnational solidarities across a range of issues. Some involved with the movement for Black Lives, for example, speak in the language of human rights and attempt to use international human rights mechanisms in some of the same ways that many African Americans have since W.E.B. Du Bois participated in the meeting to draft the UN Charter. Might the deployment of human rights from below, as some anthropologists refer to it, provide useful models for transnational solidarities? In what ways might they repeat or avoid some of the pitfalls of the discourse from above? And how might they better negotiate real tensions between the North and South and among those in each? Third, much of the human rights energy on criminal justice has long been on penal reform. Indeed, even those human rights advocates who push for greater criminal accountability generally, though not always, promote criminal punishment systems with due process, fair sentencing, good prison conditions, etc. The aim of abolition opens up questions and some disagreements over whether penal reform helps on the way to abolition or has other negative consequences. And a couple of the panels will explore just that question. Finally, although the human rights movement has long attended to issues of immigration, it has not until recently focused a great deal on immigration detention. Neither yet have the penal reform and abolitionist movements, though this work is definitely beginning. Indeed, inspired largely by Austin's grassroots leadership, an organization that, in their words, quote, works for a more just society where prison profiteering, mass incarceration, deportation, and criminalization are things of the past, we're hoping to start a conversation here, or continue a conversation, among a broad set of advocates in each of those fields. And fortunately, three leaders of grassroots leadership are on the program, which will help facilitate that connection. So we now continue the conference with readings by two award-winning poets, whose poetry both evokes the carceral world we all differently inhabit, and may allow us to glimpse a world beyond borders and without prisons. They'll be introduced by another award-winning poet, Roger Reeves, who is also an English professor at UT and a member of the Rapoport Center Steering Committee, where he steers much of our thinking about the importance of art in social justice. Roger spent an enormous amount of energy, I mean, that's an understatement, and effort in curating the reading you're about to hear. We're grateful to him for inviting Dwayne Betts and Natalie Diaz and working across campus to raise financial support for their visit, and that's many on the long list that Neville read. But as importantly as raising the funding, he made sure that as many parts of the university as possible would be able to benefit from their time here, and that's just a huge gift to the University of Texas. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Roger, who will introduce our poets and moderate the question and answer session following their readings. And I'm now going to give you permission to go till 5:05, which I know gets you to 5:07. Thank you, Roger.